post-Roman societies of northern Britain, and comparative kingship, examining early royal landscapes of Ireland and Scotland. He's undertaken fieldwork in Highland and Moray and Aberdeenshire. So here we have Gordon with a northern Pictish powerhouse, excavations at Burghead. Over to you, Gordon.
Okay, thank you very much, Kirsty. Can you all hear me okay? Hopefully, getting a few nods, yeah. I'll just try and share my screen and get going. Great to see so many of you tonight. Let me just start here. Slideshow. And let's get going. Okay, well, thank you very much to everyone in Highland Council, Susan Cruz, etc., for inviting me to come along as the interloper, the non-Highland speaker at the Highland Archaeology Conference. But hopefully you'll find lots of important information that will help interpret the archaeology of the Highlands and Scotland in a more wider context. So tonight I'm going to be talking about our Pictish projects, the Northern Picts project, and also the Comparative Kingship project at the University of Aberdeen, funded by Leverhulme Trust, University of Aberdeen Development Trust, and Historic Environment Scotland. So shout out to all of those folks. So what we've really been looking at over the last 10 years really is the archaeology of the Northern Picts and the Northern Pictish kingdoms, particularly working on Alex Wolf's movement of the most important element of Pictland, Fortru, which seems to be in the overkingship of Pictland from the 7th century up into the Moray Firth region. And that's really had a major revolutionary effect on our kind of historical knowledge of the Picts. And that's something that we've really been working with in terms of looking at the archaeology of the Northern Picts with fresh eyes, really. So we've been really working from the Tarbert Peninsula down into Aberdeenshire and increasingly across the whole of what was Pictland, from Fife to Caithness to redating sites in the Orkney Isles. So we are extending beyond our original boundaries. But tonight I'm going to be talking about Burghead. And our work at Burghead is really part of two different elements of Pictish archaeology that we have been focusing on over the last decade. One is fortified sites, which seem to be the main elite centres of this time period. They seem to underpin kingship developing in this region. But really, a lot of the excavations of these sites have been quite piecemeal, quite small scale. So work at sites like Burghead is actually beginning to flesh out our understanding of what these Pictish sites were actually like. What did they contain? How were they used? And how did they underpin authority and governance in this time period? And we've also been looking at another iconic element of the Picts, which is their symbol stones and carved stone monuments more generally. So from the early Pictish period, perhaps as early as the 3rd, 4th century, certainly by the 5th century, you get a tradition of these paired symbols appearing on carved stones, occasionally on objects as well. And they're kind of, one of the enduring mysteries of the Picts. What were these symbols? What did they represent? They certainly seem to be identifying Pictish elites, important people within a society. So in some of the later Christian cross slabs, for example, you can see these symbols next to individuals, implying that they're telling us something about their identity, their status, or even perhaps their name, which is one of the most convincing interpretations of this symbol tradition. So without further ado, let's have a look at Burghead. So Burghead is really one of the most spectacular Pictish sites we have. It's a promontory fort, and these go back into the Iron Age. We've excavated another Pictish site, promontory site at Dunacair, which seems to date back to the 3rd, 4th centuries. This site seems to date from the later second half of the 1st millennium AD, and is this promontory jutting out into the Moray Firth, and as I say, very visible on the seaways and from other parts and from parts of the Highlands as well. This is what remains of the site today. The modern town has been partly built over the fort. This is the upper citadel in the centre of the picture, next to the house at the end here. Excuse me, which is the Coast Guard station houses. And this is where we've been, where we started excavating in 2015. And then on the left and the lower citadel is the lower part of the fort. So another enclosure. This is part of the rampart still surviving here today. So kind of lumps and bumps in the grass that you can see today really belie the kind of major element, defended element of this site, and it's a very impressive nature. So it's a site that's been mapped since the 18th century. General Roy, in his famous military mapping of Scotland, depicted Burghead in the 1740s or 50s. James Cordiner records it in the 1780s in his Antiquities and Scenery of the North of Scotland. And he describes it as a peninsula made an island, which is a really nice description of this peninsula jutting out into the Moray Firth and cut off by a whole series of earthworks, particularly at the landward end, but actually earthworks extending right around the promontory as well, making for a very naturally defensive site, but also emphasized by these ramparts as well. Cordner also referred to the timber lacing of the ramparts and also to some of the sculpture as well. So, for example, he talks about a cross undefaced and in good relief, and vestiges of figures and animals as well. Oh, my screen is gone. Can you still see my screen?
If you maybe want to reshare it, Gordon. Look like someone took over the screen from you, but if you reshare it, that should work.
Okay, right, you got it now?
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So Cordner talks about the sculpture from the site, and the way he describes it certainly suggests that some of the sculpture was in a lot better condition than it is to today. So again, speaks of later development having a big effect on the survival of the fort. This is a 1789 estate plan showing the old Burghead to the south of the fort, and also areas of cultivations. Actually, parts of the lower fort were cultivated in the 18th century, whereas the upper fort seems to have been largely kept in pasture. And there's also on here marked a burial ground as well, which obviously we'll come back to later in the talk. So it survived very well until the late 19th century, early 19th century, when there was a rather sad tale of destruction of the fort when the modern town was built. And this was undertaken by a series of landowners in the area who wanted to build a new harbour for trade in the area. And essentially, a lot of the fort was destroyed in this operation. So here's MacDonald, one of the early archaeologists, talking about the site in the 1860s. And he describes how the ramparts were basically thrown back into their ditches. The seaward rampart was thrown into the bay to make the harbour. And he also describes the many coins, battle axes, spearheads that were found and given away to any passing tourist. So really quite stark words about the destruction of this fort in the early 19th century. So during that destruction, also a lot of the archaeology came to light at the same time. So there was some benefits. So Professor Stewart to the University of Aberdeen talks about the timber-laced ramparts again, and he also again talks about some of the sculpture and carvings of a bull, very well executed here. And these are some of the bull carvings that survive. As many as 30 seems to have been found during the destruction of the site in the 19th century. And MacDonald records that these were somewhere around about the northeast part of the upper citadel, which is quite interesting because that would be roughly where the entranceway was into the upper fort. And that's quite interesting in terms of that threshold into the upper citadel, probably the most important part of the fort. There's also early Christian sculpture. So I mentioned this corner talking about a cross undefaced, and this is represented by this cross slab perhaps, but you can see that it's very much not undefaced anymore. There's only a small fragment of it. And on the other side of the cross was a warrior, a mounted warrior carrying a shield and a spear. And that's very redolent of these kind of warrior kingdoms that were in operation in this early medieval period. There's also the famous well from Burghead, which was cleared out in 1809 and would have been the water supply for the fort. And it's one of the most impressive constructions within an early medieval fort known from Britain and Ireland. So it had rock-cut steps, had a pedestal and a stone basin as well. So it's quite a really impressive site, and really over the centuries it's had lots of romantic interpretations of the site and wild speculation about who built this fort, who was for, and how it was destroyed. This goes back at least to the 16th century. So Hector Boyce, who was actually the first principal of the University of Aberdeen, talks about it as a Danish fort, so built by the Vikings. It appears on Pont's map from the 16th century, the old Bro, as it's annotated on the map. Cordner also ascribes it to the Vikings, a Danish fort, whereas William Roy thought it was a Roman site. And MacDonald in the 1860s returned to it being a Viking fortress. So lots of waxing and waning of how this site has been interpreted over the years and decades and centuries. This is Pont's map here, showing the old Bra here, and also the sea lock of Rose Isle, which I'll come back to later on. So as well as being interpreted by historians and other writers over the years, it's also had lots of archaeologists interested in this site. So James MacDonald in the 1860s was the first archaeologist to really explore what remained of the fort. And he dug through some of the ramparts and was the first really to notice just how impressive these ramparts were. So this is a beautiful watercolor sketch from the archives at Historic Scotland, excuse me, showing a section through the ramparts. So James MacDonald, defying kind of modern health and safety notions and sense, dug through the lower citadel rampart and showed it was almost 8 meters wide and still survives 5 or 6 meters high today. And this annotation here on the right, you can maybe just see he's marking where the timber lacing, the timber frame for the rampart was constructed with all the rubble infill and the stone wall at either side. And then this black layer that he depicts on the right is actually midden rubbish deposits he found inside the fort. And that's a close-up of him showing the wall face and a very complex timber lacing here with transverse and horizontal timbers in the wall face here. And then Hugh Young, whose grandfather has been one of the landowners who built modern Burghead, also excavated the site in the 1890s. And we actually have some early photographs, relatively early excavation photographs of Hugh Young's work from the 1890s. And he also documented how impressive the ramparts were, noting that some of the framing of the rampart was actually tied together with big iron spikes or nails, and also identified some of the lovely wall face in places. And this is one of my favorite photographs in the HES archives, showing his workmen hidden in the kind of foggy background of this photograph. And down at the foreground is the wall face of the lower citadel rampart, or what survived of it, only a few courses in this part of the fort. Hugh Young also had some finds from the site. He had animal bones, including what looks like a poleaxe cattle skull, an ingot mold, a spearhead, and also an axe head as well. So he did find a few objects as well. But it was really the 1960s before the chronology of the site began to come to the fore, with Alan Small excavating and retrieving samples for radiocarbon dating. But unfortunately, his samples are not particularly accurate today, suggesting that this site was in use somewhere between 300 and 1000 AD. So a useful kind of scientific series of dates, but not particularly useful in terms of pinning down the exact chronology and development of the site through time. And unfortunately, we have very little left of Alan Small's archive. It seems to have gone missing. We have a few photographs of his excavation in the upper citadel here, and some nice photographs preserved in the Aberdeenshire HER, showing some of the timbers that he found, like the antiquarians did, in the wall face. And we have one or two drawings, which again, this is the kind of wall face here, sections through the rampart showing these black burnt timber. So again, it looks like he found quite impressive evidence for the timber lacing of this fort. And then in 2012, there were some development-led excavations, which showed that there were some preserved land surfaces, midden layers inside the fort, but no radiocarbon dates obtained from this series of excavations, and recovering a pivot stone from a building as well. So this is a illustration showing what survives of the fort today. In green is the ramparts that still survive. The blue ones are ones either underneath the modern town. If you're a broker in Burghead, you might own one of these houses with the ramparts going through underneath your garden and house, perhaps. And then the harbour side rampart was also destroyed. So that was the situation when we began to investigate the site in 2015. And to be honest, we went there with not an awful lot of hope. There was the antiquarian reports which suggested a lot of the upper citadel had land surface had been destroyed. There was suggestion that the lower citadel had also been lowered and some of the soil removed. So a lot of people were suggesting that really only the ramparts survived in Burghead. But we very quickly, excuse me, established that that wasn't the case. So we began excavating in the Coast Guard Station gardens of Edward Osborne's house, who very kindly let us come and destroy his garden on a regular basis. What we found was lots of 19th century rubbish, destruction, but under about a metre of overburden, we actually came down to pretty exceptionally preserved archaeology. So rather than this being one of the most poorly preserved Pictish sites, we've actually found this one of the best preserved. And it's because of the geographical location. Burghead is essentially a sand dune. It's had lots of wind blow events covering over things like floor layers. So on the bottom right here of this trench, you can see the end of a Pictish building. This is the wall here on the left. And all the black layers in the bottom right are the floor layers and the hearth. You can maybe just make a hearth here of the building. And this is actually a building that seems to date to the 9th and 10th centuries AD. And in the floor layers of that building, we found a coin of King Alfred, so the great Anglo-Saxon king. And you can actually see this coin has been pierced for wearing. So the Picts or the occupants of this building were actually wearing their wealth here. We also found these iron fittings. They could be shield fittings. They could be part of a door. I'm not quite sure about this yet. A sword hilt, so they were actually making weaponry. This seems to be an unfinished sword hilt, so you can actually see evidence here of them actually blacksmithing on site, metalworking on site. And also more kind of prosaic everyday tools. This is actually remains of a leather working tool. And so from that early days of the Northern Picts project, we began to get a series of radiocarbon dates, which suggested initial occupation in the 6th century and the site going through to the 10th century AD. So really spanning that later Pictish period up into the time period in which, at which the Pictish identity disappears in the 10th century. And so for the last 2 years, 2018, 2019, we've been funded by the Leverhulme Trust as part of the Comparative Kingship project, and also by Historic Environment Scotland due to some of the serious coastal erosion at the site, which I'll come to at the end. So 2018, we extended our trench in Edward Osborne's garden and found another building right next to the one I showed earlier, actually extending under his house and his greenhouse here. A plank-defined building with a sunken floor, a really unusual structure, which we've really only uncovered. We haven't really excavated into much to date. And you can actually see the planking here defining the edge of the building. And that same year, we also began to have a look down in the lower rampart as well, which hadn't been excavated since the 19th century. And we looked at the lower citadel rampart, the ones investigated by Young and MacDonald. This was a major engineering operation. It's a huge mound of rubble, essentially, spilling into the trench. But we did manage to get down to the lower midden layers and find pits dug into the subsoil, and eventually got to the wall face, excavating with to the very lower courses of the wall face, which only survived a few courses, but we managed to sample right up against that wall underneath it as well. An outline chronology for or the lower citadel rampart at least, which seems to be 7th and 8th century. So the visible remains that you see in the lower citadel in terms of the defences seems to date from that late 7th to 8th century AD context. So beginning to narrow down the chronology compared to Alan Small's very useful radiocarbon dates. We also found some really nice detail about the architecture of the monument. Dave McGovern found that some of the stones that we showed him had these point chisel marks, and essentially these are the stonemasons building the Pictish fort, creating nice faces to those stones using a chisel to create a nice even face to the stonework. So suggesting the amount of labour and effort and skill that went into building this incredible series of ramparts and fort. And then in the upper citadel, our trench on the seaward end actually found an even better preserved rampart, which actually is very well preserved because it actually seems to be recessed into the slope. So the lower courses were probably always covered with sand. And you can see the kind of black bands here are actually the burnt timbers from the timber lacing of the fort. And this is a little plan or section drawing showing the timber lacing, showing horizontal timbers in the wall face, just like the antiquarian showed, and also transverse timbers, which would have been the framework, creating the solid nature of the rampart. And then in 2019, last year, we went back on a bigger scale, excavating more trenches in the lower citadel, trenches up in the upper citadel, and found, just reiterations of the impressive nature of the architecture. So this is another section we dug up against that rampart on the seaward end. Our trench edges are really wobbly, and this is because it's really difficult and quite dangerous to excavate these sections. This is essentially a 3-meter high standing rampart dug into sand, and the other side of the rampart has been lost to erosion. So we're able to kind of get little windows into the architecture here. And again, we found that horizontal beams, the transverse beams, and again, the lower part of the rampart actually unburnt. It was buried when the upper part of the rampart was destroyed by fire. And in 2019, we found evidence for buildings up against the rampart. So this is just the corner of a building with a quernstone in the floor here on an upper citadel. Here's another view of it here. And it looks like they had turf walls to these buildings, because all we get really is the actual floor layers themselves, and very little in the way of structural timbers or post holes or anything like that. This is near the entranceway to the upper citadel, and we found another building, this with part of the stonework, perhaps the foundation for a turf wall. On the outside, this has been a rectangular building. And in the lower citadel, the kind of mother of all buildings, or we think it's a building, it's so large we need to go back and really extend this trench to make sure it is. But you can see this wall curving around here, and on the interior, areas of cobbling and this very dark, rich floor layers, which is absolutely jam-packed full of animal bone, and probably at least 5 or 6 different layers within the structure here. So this trench is about 22 meters long. So if it is a building, it's clearly a monumental building down in this lower citadel. So again, in terms of the preservation of this site, it's way beyond what we've got at any other Pictish site in terms of the number of buildings inside, the scale of the architecture, and the preservation of the floor levels is just really exceptional. And so from that last 2 years of work, we've got an even more detailed chronology. But actually, the broad pattern is still sticking. So it seems to the site seems to start, or at least the most obvious elements of that. It is possible there might be deeper stratigraphy and phases at certain parts of the site. But what you see today seems to largely date from the 6th century, early 7th century, through to the 10th century, and it seems to end somewhere between 930 and 980 AD. So that's what we found to date. So just for the next part of the lecture, I want to concentrate on thinking about how to begin to interpret the evidence. What does the site tell us about this promontory fort in the Pictish period, and how might we find out more through further excavation, further analysis? And this is really early days. We haven't finished excavating. We were meant to be there last month, unfortunately, but due to the current situation, it was all cancelled. And we're hoping we'll have at least 3 more years of excavation at the site. So in terms of interpreting the evidence, the kind of most obvious thing to start with is really the sheer scale of Burghead. It really outpaces almost every other early medieval site we know from northern Britain this time period, until we found the 16-hectare enclosure at Tappanoth, but let's not dwell on that too much. But in terms of complex nuclear-style forts or promontory forts, then it far exceeds anything else we have from Pictland, and again from elsewhere in early medieval northern Britain. So this is a comparative plan showing Burghead at scale to Dundurn, another major Pictish fort, and Donad, which is often described as the capital of Dalriada on the west coast, and you can see how small Donad is in comparison to Burghead. So it certainly talks of a very important central place of the northern Picts, and very likely to be one of the key royal centres of this time period, perhaps a key royal centre of Fortru, the northern over-kingship of Pictland. What's also, I think, beginning to emerge is just how densely occupied this site must have been in the early medieval period. So I've just put together this quick sketch showing the trenches that we've dug in the interior, marked in red, and the buildings, or what we think are buildings, marked in grey. And you can see that every large trench we've dug in the interior has hit a building of some kind. And that can't be coincidence. It doesn't seem likely that we're missing, that's going to be the only buildings found in the interior. It suggests that this is a densely packed, densely occupied, almost, kind of town-like scale of settlement at the site of Burghead. Whether it was occupied year-round remains to be seen, or at all times, is debatable. But certainly it looks like it was very densely occupied at various points in its history. What we've begun to reveal is a huge faunal assemblage from the site, so a huge number of animal bones coming from the different buildings where we're excavating, particularly from the lower citadel, where preservation seems to be better than the upper citadel, or there's different patterns of discard and preservation here. So in this lower trench 18, we have, as I say, 5 or 6 different occupation horizons within this building, and a huge number of animal bone coming from those different layers. And basically, we've excavated this tiny little slot through this occupation layers here and here, and we already have an assemblage of about 3,400 fragments of bone, which for mainland Pictish sites is a huge number. The assemblage is dominated by cattle, pig, and sheep and goat. Other domesticates are rare, as are other birds, fish, and wild animals, but there is a very small percentage, including things like deer, horse bones, and fish bone as well. The meatier parts of the animals are there, and most of the animal bones are there from the whole carcass, suggesting at least some of the animals are probably reared locally, but others might be brought in as well. There's clear evidence of butchery on site, so again, people actually occupying the site, feeding the royal court or whoever's occupying the site. And we're beginning to piece together the kind of faunal signature of the site. So it shows that cows are being slaughtered for their beef, and probably sheep are as well. So they're culled before the age of 3, suggesting kind of production for meat rather than for wool. The cows might be for dairying, as observed on the Irish sites. And what's really, I think, particularly fascinating about the faunal signature is just how it groups together with a particular class of site. So this is a little diagram here made by Edward Massell-McLean, showing the types of animal bone and the percentages of cattle, pigs, and sheep. And you can see the Burghead groups together with other Pictish forts, Tap, Dundurn, and Riney. Oops, spelled wrong there. And also Clatchercraig to the right there. And then on the right-hand part of the diagram, you've got the sites like Iona and Port Mahomet, so ecclesiastical sites. So they have quite a different signature, which is more cattle-dominated than the pig-dominated assemblages of secular power centres. And then Dunbar is an Anglo-Saxon power centre up in the top here, and you can see it's got an entirely different signature. So you can see the different groups, different social and political groups within Scotland are using different animal economies and animal rearing strategies. So that's really fascinating. We're also beginning to do some isotopic analysis of the animal bone as well. And what's really interesting is that at least some of the animals are reared locally in the Burghead area, judging by the isotopic kind of coastal signature they have. But we're also getting suggestions, but we need to really follow this up, that at least some of the cattle in particular seem to be from a larger catchment. So they might be bringing cattle as tribute to this major centre at Burghead. And that's something we really need to follow up with more things like incremental isotopic sampling. And this is work by Kate Britton and Javita and Orshi at University of Aberdeen. So what we've also found during the post-excavation by going through the existing assemblages from Burghead is evidence for a cemetery at Burghead. So this is MacDonald talking about the removal of a portion of the north rampart of the fort, of the lower citadel. Excuse me. And he talks about bodies being disinterred from the lower citadel on the outside of the ramparts, outside the fort. And he talks about a skull with a round hole in its upper part, and also rows of bodies, so some sort of cemetery. And this was located somewhere where this red circle is. So actually a cemetery outside the fort on the seaward side. And lo and behold, in the National Museum collections from Hugh Young's excavations, but probably actually from MacDonald's excavations, we have this skull with a hole in the top of it. And this has been analysed by Ange Boyle, who's doing a PhD at University of Edinburgh, sorry. Shows that it was a male, but 45 years old, with bad teeth. And we sampled this for radiocarbon dating. And we also sampled a long bone, a femur, that was found, another human bone from the animal bone collections from National Museum. And this is the dates we got, 7th to 8th century AD. So this cemetery seems to be contemporary with the main occupation at Burghead. So that's really fascinating. We've got evidence for occupation by the living, and also the dead being disposed of at Burghead as well. We're also looking at isotopes of the human remains as well. And one of the interesting elements from Kate and Orshi's work, and also dating by Juliet Mitchell, and one of the interesting elements of the isotopic signature of the Burghead skull is it shows some evidence for fish consumption, which actually is very unusual from human remains from Scotland from the Neolithic through to the high medieval period is very, very rare. We also know that there must have been an ecclesiastical component, an early church at Burghead, and that's based on the fragments of cross slabs, the shrine or altar fragments shown by the early medieval sculpture. And this seems to come from the area of the modern graveyard, which Roy plotted as being at the entrance to the landward ramparts. And the presence of an early medieval church within a fortified centre like this is really exceptional. And again, it shows just how important this site of Burghead was in the early medieval period in northern Pictland. And finally, I guess one last consideration is, what other function might a Burghead have? And the obvious element of Burghead is its coastal location next to a fine harbour, the modern harbour, but it was also an important harbouring point prior to the 19th century. And this has led to certain scholars interpreting this as a naval base, as some sort of home port for the Pictish Navy, as Ian Shepherd described in 1993, and other archaeologists like Sally Foster and Ian Ralston following this interpretation. But others like James Fraser, a bit more skeptical of this, highlighting, I think rightfully, that there wouldn't have been a standing Pictish navy as we would understand it today. However, that's not to say that early medieval kingdoms and kings did not have fleets. We know that they did. So the Census for Nalban from Dalriada is this fascinating document compiled in the 7th and probably 10th century AD, and it's a genealogy and also a muster for the army and the fleet of Dalriada, so the Scots in Western Scotland, who would have been contemporary with the Picts in the East. And this is a fascinating document that describes the levy for the army and the fleet. And this is organized through households and kindreds and seems to be drawn from the whole of Dalriada. So, rather than having one location for the fleet, you're actually drawing upon the wider kindred group to create the fleet at times of war. And it's really interesting because it describes the levy as being 2 7-bench ships per 20 households. So if you work that out, it's something like 140 ships the kings of Dalriada were able to draw upon at times of war. And we know that there were sea battles in this time period. So there's fascinating reference in the Annals of Ulster from 719 to the fleet of Dalriada engaged in a sea battle. And a sea battle implies that an advanced level of seamanship and warfare at sea. It kind of implies that they're perhaps tying boats together, engaged in warfare. And clearly it was effective because it was a number of nobles fell in this particular battle. And you also get other references to the fleet of Dalriada as well from Annals of Tigernach in 753, for example. But what about the Pictish fleet? Well, we don't have any direct references to the Pictish fleet, but there is this really fascinating record from AD 681, which is in the Annals of Ulster and Annals of Tigernach, which refer to the Orkneys, and that's how they describe the Orkneys in the Annals as a collective, were deleted or destroyed by Brithay or Brood, the Pictish king, powerful Pictish king, the same one who wins the Battle of Nectarsmere in AD 685. So that implies that this king had an extensive fleet, presumably centered on the fleet of Fortune, sailing to the Orkneys and destroying them in AD 681. And then there's another really interesting annal account of 729, which talks about the destruction of 150 Pictish vessels at Ross Cuisine. And 150 Pictish vessels must be a war fleet. It's actually very similar to that number from the census in Dalriada. And this occurs during a civil war amongst some of the powerful Pictish kings. So was this fleet going to southern Pictland? Was it going north again? But the actual location is quite fascinating. Ross Cuisine is interpreted as the headland of Cushnie, and that's Troop Head in Aberdeenshire today. And this is the location of another promontory fort called Cullycan that we know was occupied during the Pictish period through the excavations of Colvin and Moira Gregg. So, was this the actual Pictish fleet mustering at another promontory fort on its way elsewhere, or was it returning from a battle somewhere in Pictland? But we really will never know that probably. But it's fascinating to think about the potential role of promontory forts in mustering the Pictish fleet. What kind of boats might the Picts had? Well, again, we have very little detail on this. We tend to imagine when we talk about early medieval boats, the coracles, the leather vessels described in the Life of Columba, for example. Life of Columba, talking about Cormac's three journeys, one of the acolytes of Columba, talks about the leathern covering of Cormac's ship as he sails into the far north to find a place of hermitage, which he never quite succeeds. But if you read the Life of Columba closely, Athavan actually talks about a whole series of different kinds of vessels, from small coracles to what are clearly timber boats. So he talks about dragging long boats of hewn pine and oak over land. So clearly there were timber vessels as well as coracles as well. And actually in the Irish version of the Voyage of St. Brendan goes on some crazy sea journeys as well. And his actual second voyage, he uses a wooden ship after his mother berates him for using a dangerous leather bound coracle. And we also know from the annals of Tigernach in 737 that the abbot of Applecross was drowned in the open sea with his sailors to the number of 22. So that implies an 11 bench ship, which is bigger than the ships described in the census. So it certainly implies that there were much larger wooden vessels available to the Picts. And if we look at the background to the potential types of vessels that the Picts might use, that makes a lot of sense. So we have plank-built vessels being used in Britain from the Bronze Age onwards, and there are one or two finds in places like London and on the Severn that have plank-built vessels from the Roman Iron Age, native-built vessels. We have the Broitergol vessel, which is found in our is often been thought to represent a leather vessel, but actually it could easily be a timber vessel, and certainly it's a 9-bencher, so 18 rowers here, and also a sail, and this is thought to date from the 1st or 2nd century AD. So again, it suggests a much more advanced level of boatmanship and boat building available to early medieval groups in Britain and Ireland in this time period. And obviously the famous Sutton Hoo vessel from the 7th century. These are the kind of things that were going around in the North Sea at a period contemporary with the early phases of Burghead. And this ship had 20 rowers on each side, so 40 in total. So while we might not see Burghead as a naval base, perhaps, for the entire Pictish fleet, I think it certainly seems very likely that the royal vessels of kings might be stationed at Burghead, and that sites like Burghead may well be really important as mustering points and harbourages for the Pictish fleet. And this is a fantastic reconstruction of the landscape by Michael Strategos, showing the Loch of Roseisle and Loch Spiny in this area, showing the sheltered sea anchorages that this coastline would have had prior to sand dunes closing off the Loch of Roseisle, and similarly with Spiny, and then the subsequent draining. So I think we're talking about a very important maritime landscape, and Burghead and other promontories forts potentially being at the centre of important maritime networks in this early medieval period. And then just finally to end, how did the site come to an end? Well, the kind of local folklore and the archaeological interpretation usually centre around Viking attacks destroying the site in the 10th century. But actually, there's a whole series of different conflicts happening, major transitions happening in the 10th century that may come into play and explain the end of Burghead. So there are recorded battles between the men of Fortru and Vikings in AD 904, for example. But there's also in AD 934, Athelstan, the Anglo-Saxon king, leading land and sea forces all the way up to perhaps to Moray and even as far as Caithness. That's sort of context in which a site like Burghead could be destroyed. But there's a whole series of different events, and hopefully through the next few years we can begin to pin the chronology, the end of Burghead, down to an even narrower margin. So finally, just to end on, I guess, a kind of story note about the site and one of the reasons that we're continuing to excavate here is the coastal erosion that's happening right across Scotland. We're probably more familiar with coastal erosion happening in the Northern Isles and the Western Isles, but it's happening all along the Moray coast and the east coast of Scotland as well. And at Burghead, it's very extensively undermining the upper citadel here. That's the spoil heaps from our trench you can see at the top here of this photograph, and you can see it's undercutting the cliff. And over a century, we've lost more than 8 meters of coastline at Burghead. And presumably that's when the likes of the cemetery noted by MacDonald gets destroyed, or at least partly destroyed. So we are losing a lot of archaeology. And essentially, the rampart wall face that we dug over the last 2 years is about 0.5 meter away from that active erosion edge. So we now have money from HES to extend our project for 3 years to try and essentially rescue as much of the archaeology of the upper citadel at the seaward end before erosion has even more of an effect. Right, so thank you very much for listening. Lots of people contribute to this talk, including my team of excavators and all the people working on the post-excavation, the bioarchaeology perspectives and the historical context as well. So thank you very much to all of them, and to everyone who volunteered, worked on the excavations, and our project over the years. So thanks very much for listening, and I think over to questions.
Thank you, Gordon. That was wonderful. Let Echo go away in a minute. So we have got a lot of questions on the chat. Remember, if you want to put a question in there, then please do. We'll try to get through them. And you might need to stop sharing your screen, Gordon. Is that shared? And you can also raise your hand icon, and we can come to you that way if you want to ask a question that way. So I'm going to go back to the beginning, actually. And there was a question from Carolyn McNamara that you might have to remind us what slide was on when you put this one in, Caroline. It says, how does the warrior on that stone compare with the mounted people on the stones at Govan? Gordon, do you know which slide that was about? It was quite early on. Or Caroline, can you come back to us and just unmute yourself and let us know which particular one it was? Oh, I think you're on mute, Gordon. You're on mute, I think, Gordon. Oh, can someone unmute Gordon if he's... I'm just trying to unmute Gordon.
I don't think we can unmute Gordon. Oh. I think Gordon has to unmute himself.
Gordon, did you find the slide? Can you unmute and then Gordon, let us know what you think? I think we've lost Gordon. Has he gone? Or something happened to the screen here? Does anyone notice? It looks like it's just normal, does it? To me, it looks a bit odd. But I don't know if Gordon can still hear us. Gordon, can you hear us? Give us a wave. You might have frozen. I think we might have lost our speaker.
If Gordon can still hear us, it might be worth him just leaving and coming back in again. And you'll come back in unmuted.
Well, okay, let's try again. Let's hope he comes back. Right, let's check that he comes back in. We'll let him in. Here he comes. Is he in now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Yeah. Can't see you. You should be popping up in a minute. But
I turned video on, so maybe made my whole system crash.
You're back now.
So, right. the cross slab with the warrior. Yeah, it's one of the few fragments we have of a cross slab from Burghead. Although there are other fragments that might be from the same monument or other monuments. Is it similar to the ones at Govan? It's probably in the same ballpark in terms of dating, 8th, 9th century, I would say, and is part of that broader tradition of mounted warriors that you find right across Pickland and occasionally out with Pickland as well. So it seems to be these mounted warriors are found at some of the other elite centres you find across Pickland. So it's part of that broader symbolism of power and alignment with the Christian Church in terms of these warrior figures being on cross slabs of that same period. So yeah, fascinating monument.
That's great, thank you. I don't know, Gordon, if are you able to turn your video back on so we can see, or are you having bandwidth trouble? Don't worry if you can't. Oh, there you are. Okay, you're back. So thank you. I hope that answered your question, Carolyn. I've got another one now from Alistair Fraser. Did you get carbon-14 dates from the upper citadel, and if so, how do these compare with the lower rampart dates?
Yeah, we've got dates from the upper citadel from the house floors we showed. And also from the rampart itself in the upper citadel, which is a bit harder to date because we haven't really got to the bottom very successfully rampart because it's so buried by all those layers of sand built up against it. But as far as we can tell, it seems to be broadly contemporary with the lower citadel. But I think we need better dates really to say, is that whole defensive scheme part of one build? Or is it, built up over time? But we certainly got dates from the upper citadel that go from the 6th to the 10th century. So again, it seems to be broadly contemporary with what we've got down the lower citadel as well.
Perfect, thank you. Have you done any geophysics across that whole big area?
Yeah, we did try geophysics, and it did show up some anomalies, which you can broadly correlate to some of the things we found. But one of the issues is you got about, certainly in the upper fort, you got almost a meter of overburden with all the sand layers and the 19th century demolition layers. So the chances of it showing up anything too concrete is probably small, but it does seem to give us hints about where some of the major occupation layers are in the lower citadel, where it's a bit more shallow, for example. But it'd be worth trying some other techniques in the future, maybe some ground penetrating radar and things like that might show up more. But for now, excavation is definitely the best way to map all what we've got. So what we're doing is fairly low impact, stripping the topsoil off and mapping what we've got, and then only excavating a small percentage. And that'll be the case for the ongoing project, apart from in the upper citadel near the seaward rampart, where we'll excavate all the deposits in advance of erosion.
That's good. I mean, I liked your trenches, and each one had a building in it. It'd be nice if you had a bit of geophysics that showed up just buildings everywhere. That would be something. So we'll look forward to that. It's a new technique. The next question from Alistair Fraser: do you know how the skull got the hole? Was it the cause of death? Was it after death, before death?
We got very excited about that. Weapon wounds or spear holes and the like. But it actually looks like either the pickaxe of the workmen who found it, or some sort of later, dropping of skull type incident. Because we've had Ange Boyle at Edinburgh look at it, and also our osteoarchaeologist Rebecca Crozier, and yeah, it seems to be later damage rather than nice tasty weapon below to the, fortunately. So no, we don't know how that individual died. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to go through the questions in order here, and we'll see how far we get because we're getting quite a lot in now. So the next one: did you find any suggestions from your excavations of what was in their diet apart from meat?
What was in their diet? So we get things like charred barley. So they're definitely cultivating crops as well. And all the animal bone as well. We've got some fish bone, so they are exploiting the sea, and we can see that isotopically as well, as I mentioned in the lecture. At the moment, that's as much as we've got. What we're going to try and do over the next few years with our nice floor layers is do things like phytolith analysis, which will tell us more about plant use. So that might pick up different types of plant resources they're using. We do find rarer creatures as well, things like geese and ducks by the looks of it, but it's very small numbers. So they are living an agricultural diet, but it will be fascinating to flesh out that picture over the next few years as we excavate more into the actual occupation deposits that we've kind of uncovered so far.
Okay, thank you. Now, we haven't had any hands up. I don't know if anyone wants to ask a question directly, but I'm wondering, Andy, if you're there, have you managed to get any, because we've got so many questions, can you pull any of them together for me, or if you're there? Oh, you're on mute, Andy.
Sorry, Kirsty. Yeah, no, I am
okay.
here.
Oh, we can get. You think we can get through them all?
Yeah, no, I think you can probably get through them all. There's another question going back to the ramparts, though, about whether or not the ramparts were vitrified.
No evidence of vitrification in the rampart. They are burnt, so we can see that with the upper timbers of the upper citadel. So that's clearly been destroyed by fire at some point, but the fire obviously wasn't hot enough to actually vitrify any of the ramparts. So it's not a vitrified rampart as far as we can see anywhere we've excavated so far, and it's not something mentioned by the antiquarians either. So yes to burning, and probably that's part of the destruction of the site. But again, we need to tie the chronology down a bit more. But no vitrification.
I think that might possibly answer the last question that's just come in as well from Alan Gillies about, does the charred timber in the rampart indicate a destruction by fire? So presumably then, Gordon, you're thinking, yes, it probably does in this instance. Yeah,
you can see that really well, because the actual lower part of the upper citadel, as I say, seems to have been excavated into the slope of the hill. So the lower part seems like it was always covered by sand. You know, they dug a foundation, built the stonework up, and then put the soil back. And that's all unburnt, and we don't find any evidence of the timbers because they've just rotted away. Whereas the upper timbers are charred and burnt by fire to an extent that we actually get big chunks of oak timber from the destruction of the framework. So yeah, definitely seems to be towards the end of occupation of the fort.
That's great, thank you. We've got one here from, where are we? From Susan Conti. What can you say about the religion of the Picts from the site of Burghead? Is there anything that you can pull together from that?
In terms of the religion, I guess we're probably dealing with largely a Christian community. I think by the time our dates suggest the site's really getting into its flow by the late 6th century, and certainly by the 7th century, we are probably dealing with a largely, if not exclusively, Christian community at Burghead. So by the time we get people like Bede talking about the Picts in the early 8th century, there's no hint that there's any pagan Picts by that time period. Are the bulls part of an earlier pagan element to the fort? Possible, but I don't think that's proven in any way. But certainly the early Christian sculpture talks of an important church site actually being on location within the fort itself at Burghead, which again, I really can't think of any other examples where we have very definitive evidence for a church within a fort of that date from northern Britain, as far as I can think of. It's very unusual anyway. So yeah, definitely talks of a Christian community, and again, the importance of the site to actually have its own church within the fort itself.
Certainly, when you saw your comparisons of scale between Dunad and things, it looks like there's room for it at Burghead. Or may not have been at other places. It was quite a remarkable slide, that one. The next question I have from Graham Grant. Is there much evidence of Romano-British cultural interchanges in the early Pictish history?
Ooh, right, we're getting away from Burghead. Not at Burghead, so again, it's too late in terms of what we found so far. But the sites like Dunacair down in Aberdeenshire, we are finding the Picts exchanging objects, perhaps raiding the empire. So you get glass vessels, Roman pottery turning up at that promontory fort from the 3rd, 4th centuries, and probably stretching back to the 2nd, even 1st century AD. And certainly that is part of probably a major impetus to the Picts becoming more cohesive as a group is the Roman presence to the south. So there's lots of records of the Picts raiding the Roman Empire, particularly into the 4th century AD, involved in things like the barbarian conspiracy against the Romans in AD 367, and that talks of the Picts colluding with the Scots, with the Saxons and other early medieval groups, which certainly suggests that the Roman presence, for the better or worse, is definitely having an effect on communities this far north.
Thank you. Another question here. Any idea of coastal erosion rates near the site? Have probable historic coastlines been worked out for the area? How much difference between Pictish times and now? So how much evidence have we lost, do you think? Obviously, we've lost it inland locks, haven't we? But what else have we missed?
Yeah. It's not an exact science working this out, but certainly the Scottish Government Dynamic Coast Project suggests we've lost 8 meters between 1900 roughly and 2011. But I think it could even be worse than that. So various locals talk about meeting on grassy areas below the fort in relatively recent times. Today, there's no grassy area underneath the fort there. And the fact that you had a cemetery outside the rampart on the lower citadel certainly suggests there was extensive land outside the fort on that seaward side. And why build such a big rampart on that side unless you do have some sort of land down below it? So I think we've probably lost quite a lot. And it's a sandstone, so it's a relatively hard sandstone. So it's definitely susceptible to some amount of erosion. At sites like Dunacair, where it's a conglomerate and a very soft sandstone, we've lost most of the fort over the last 1500 years. So it is variable depending on hard rock geology there, but it's certainly becoming a more and more threatening element to the survival of the fort.
That's great, thank you. Do we have any more questions? Has anyone raised their hand that I've missed? Or Andy, have I missed anyone in the chat there? I think I've covered most of it, or have more come in. Andy, are you able to?
No, you've missed lots actually, Kirsty.
Okay. I've lost my place. Okay.
Hang on a second. Right. Okay. So about the site itself. So there's a question here. Is it thought that the site has been continuously occupied, or is it thought that it was abandoned in the 10th century or later?
It's a good question. Not one we can very obviously answer as of yet. We do get the odd sherd of green glaze, from 12th, 13th century on the site. But nothing in the way of obvious structures or occupation from that time period as of yet. And pretty much in the lower citadel, you take off the plough soil and you're straight down onto early medieval deposits. And likewise in the upper citadel, once you take off all the 19th century overburden, you're pretty much straight down to 9th, 10th century deposits. So there's not an awful lot of evidence of it being occupied after the 10th century. Obviously, you've got the old village of Burghead, being there in the 18th century, but how, what kind of level of occupation you had of the headland between the 18th century and the 10th century is not yet obvious, but it doesn't seem extensive. So it does seem like whatever happened in the 10th century created a major hiatus in occupation of the headland.
Okay, and sort of related to this, I guess, in terms of the specifics of the site, is the well definitely Pictish?
Oh God, you're asking all the difficult questions now. We don't know that for sure. It certainly is got, well, by the sounds of it, there's lots of different conflicting accounts, but there's one record that suggests one of the bulls was found in the well or near the well. So it's certainly of that broad time period. There has been suggestions it could date further back to the Roman Iron Age or even the Iron Age. I suspect, given its complexity and its position in the lower citadel, I would suspect it's contemporary with the main phases of occupation in the 7th, 8th century, but it could be, for example, 6th century, and it gets increasingly enveloped by the ramparts on that side in the 7th and 8th centuries. But without some sort of modern excavation there, it's difficult to pin down the chronology more. It'd be fascinating to try that, but the depth of deposits there are incredible. So I don't know how you would do it modern health and safety wise and not have to undertake major shoring, etc. So at the moment we can't tell, but I suspect it is probably broadly contemporary with the Pictish site. Yeah.
Okay, and probably another difficult question for you. Is there any indication of whether the people living at Burghead were local or came from further afield?
Again, early days to tell that. We only have two bits of human, for want of a better phrase, from Burghead, and that's the skull and also a long bone. So that's all we've got to go on at the moment. The initial isotopic work suggests that the individual represented by the skull is probably local, but we need to do more work to tell that. It'll also be fascinating to do some genetic work as well. It's part of some of the other genetic work we're beginning to do on ancient Pictish skeletons. But yeah, early days to tell, and we don't have a huge amount to go on in terms of actual human remains. So, even if we have two individuals, that's two out of, must have been hundreds, if not thousands, of Picts who lived at the site.
Okay, and one more from me, Kirsty. I've got a question here from Ruth saying, I may have missed it, but have you found any evidence of buildings in the higher citadel? And would it be a royal site if it is so heavily populated as the number of buildings suggest?
I don't think there's any doubt that it is built by and for the elites of Pictland. So you're talking about, the kings and rulers of Fortrue in northern Pictland in that time period. And I don't think there's any doubt that they would have been at that site at various points in its history. But whether it was occupied year-round by a king of Pictland seems less likely. Generally it's thought that kings of this time period are moving around their territories, occupying different sites, lowland palaces, hill forts, promontory forts. But they certainly would have, I think almost certainly included Burghead as part of the royal circuit in this time period. And if there really is, an element of the Pictish fleet, the king's ships or whatever, at some sort of harbour or at the beachfront at Burghead, then I think it's very likely that that is again of the highest status of this time period. I think again the scale, the density of settlement really highlights how important the site was. And I think it's going to be interesting to see if we can pin down not only the chronology of the site, but the chronology of occupation. Is it occupied year round? or is it, at certain times it's only occupied by a small retinue or caretakers of the site? It's all questions we will hope to address over the coming years.
Thank you, Gordon. I've got 3 more questions, if you can stay with us for that. Now, the next one is about digging up other gardens in the village. Have you had any thoughts of trying some speculative excavations, maybe over the ramparts where they are, or anywhere else within the fort and the gardens of the village?
I'd love to in some ways, but we're kind of concentrating on the areas that need the most attention in terms of, coastal erosion, and also trying to understand the density of occupation interior, which is, I think, one of the big questions that we haven't really addressed with early medieval forts on any particular big scale is, how densely occupied were they? How many buildings were inside? What did these buildings look like even? We've got probably, I think, 1 building from Clatchard Craig, couple from Dunacair, 1 or 2 from Riney, but very, very few buildings, and certainly not preserved to the extent they are at Burghead. So actually beginning to tell you what, a high status building inside a fort like Burghead look like sounds like a really simple question, but something that we, again, don't know enough about. So hopefully the Burghead project can tell us more about that, the Citadel project, funded by HES. So, yeah, that's what we hope to do over the coming years.
That one, it ties into another question about what are your next plans? What are you planning for next year? And so it's. Yeah,
well, as I say, we should have been there last month. Gutted. It doesn't really cover it really. But basically, the Citadel project will try and excavate as much between the Coastguard station houses and the seaward rampart in the upper Citadel as we possibly can within initially a 3-year phase. It might be a 6-year phase depending on how it goes and the amount of funding that's available. And basically try and excavate all the deposits prior to any further erosion, and record as much of that beautiful wall face we have at the seaward end. And then allied with that, we're going to continue our work in the lower Citadel, but on a kind of strip and map, so kind of low-level sampling, but trying to uncover and plan as much of the buildings and structures we've got in the lower Citadel. So between that 2 initiatives, hopefully we should have a really good sample of the interior of a major Pictish fort like this, and actually be able to tell you for once, there were X number of buildings in this area. They're arranged like this. The buildings are this size. They have turf walls. They have crock frames, whatever it is. So hopefully by the end of that, we'll have the most detailed view of any Pictish fort we have to date. At least that's the plan. So hopefully there's no more delays.
Hopefully that'll come back. And if you can't go back to the Citadel, we have a question about how much has been found from the seabed, and it kind of ties into another question: is the cemetery likely to have survived, or has it been lost to coastal erosion? Might you find some of that if you're doing underwater stuff, which may be more accessible just now than running a big excavation on land?
Yeah. I think in the sea, I doubt we'll find anything, certainly nothing intact. The sea is just too active there to actually preserve anything. It's a very destructive force. So even if you had nice bits of sculpture falling into the sea, I think they'd be so rolled around, the chances of finding anything would be pretty minimal. And any deposits are likely to be washed away fairly quickly. In terms of the cemetery, possibly, but probably not. So there is a little roadway that goes around, the lower Citadel today. But as far as we know, a lot of that is made ground in the modern period, probably replacing ground that was lost through earlier coastal erosion. So I think it's probably unlikely. We'd have to dig up the modern road. So we might not be very popular in the village. But even then, I suspect it's probably gone. But it would be nice to try it and see.
It's nice to think that things might be buried under that destructive layer that you know it's actually protecting something, but who knows? It's there for the future, isn't it? I think that's all our questions. So I'm just going to say thank you very much, and I do hope you get back there soon because we want to see the full plan, please. If not excavated, then at least by some sort of non-destructive method. And yeah, we look forward to hearing from you after your next season, I think. So thanks very much for everyone turning up, for everyone who's come to the festival, and to our speaker tonight. Thanks, Gordon. We'll see you sometime. Bye.
Where do we get our cup of tea now?